Clips from the show Psych that I enjoy. I find the comedy hilarious, and so do my boys. But no eating candy until we've looked through it. That was kind of the household rule that all of the kids that grew up in the 80s and 90s had, because all of the parents had read the stories. They'd seen the newscasts of these malevolent strangers that were somehow hiding razor blades and used needles and broken glass and maybe lacing your candy with drugs or poison. All of the parents had heard these things, and so as a kid, running out into the cool, crisp air of an October evening with all of your friends looking for all the sugars that you could possibly gather, you weren't allowed to eat any of it until you dumped it out on the floor, probably shag carpet, and had your parents go through all of the candy. And maybe, just maybe like Sean, if your dad was a police officer, you'd have to go down to the precinct and have him x-ray the whole thing for razor blades. Now, I never found any of my Butterfingers laced with cocaine, and I never had used heroin needles sticking out of my Laffy Taffy when I was a kid, but doesn't mean it couldn't happen. But the problem was it didn't happen. In fact, it never happened. Not just to me, it just never happened. You see, the news media, starting in actually the 50s and the 60s, and then really resurging in the late 70s, 80s, and even 90s, sensationalized some stories that had been more like old wives' tales of these dangerous, homicidal strangers that were trying to indiscriminately harm or even kill children by poisoning candy. Disney actually made a movie about this. But it didn't happen. And so the news media, like they're apt to do, they played off of every parent's worst fear. That someone or something was going to happen to their children. Someone was secretly trying to harm them. And so they did what every good parent does. They do everything possible to protect their kids. And so I dumped all my candy out on the floor and we'd go through it, and I eventually would get to eat it all, other than the stuff that I'm sure my parents stole in the middle of the night, like I do to my boys. The problem was the media did what they do. Their job was to get more eyeballs on those news reports or those magazines or those newspapers, because eyeballs equals dollars, and their job is to make money, not to give you fully accurate and completely honest news. And so what they did is they took some stories from real police cases, 5 in particular, that had to do with Halloween candy. But during those investigations, all 5 came to find out that it wasn't the candy being given to these children by some strangers that ended up causing the deaths of these 5 children. In 3 of those cases, those children tragically died from natural and completely unrelated natural causes. They just happened to also eat Halloween candy around the same time as when they passed away. And in 2 of those cases, it wasn't strangers, but actually family members that had taken the lives of those children and then used Halloween candy as a red herring in a copycat effect, trying to throw off the investigation of the police officers. And the news media went nuts. They loved it, I guess, because they were very popular news stories. But it turns out that the vast majority of your neighbors are not homicidal killers trying to poison your children or put razor blades in their Laffy Taffy. They're actually good people that are just handing out candy to kids. Because our world is actually just a little bit safer than we've been led to believe that it is. In fact, according to almost every single measurable statistic that humans have been tracking and researching, we are currently living in the safest and most prosperous point in the entire history of the human species on planet Earth. It has never been safer to be a human than it is right now. Despite everything you've heard, all the stories you've read, all of the BuzzFeed headlines, you are safer than any other human who's ever lived. Everything from life expectancy, which just in the last 50 years has risen 20 years. In 1900, the average lifespan for a human on planet Earth was about 31 years old. That was about what you could be expected to live to if you made it past the age of 2, which was pretty hard to do. Right now, the average lifespan of a human is 70 across the globe. And if you live in America, it's about 80, more if you're female. Global poverty has also been drastically improved. For instance, 200 years ago in 1820, which seems like a long time ago, but really wasn't on a historical timeline. In 1820, 94% of the world's population lived in poverty, less than $2 a day. And yeah, that's been adjusted for current inflation rates. 94% of the world's population lived on less than $2 a day. 84% lived in abject extreme poverty. That means less than $1 a day. 84% of the world's population. Today, those numbers have plummeted to less than 10%. 9.6% of the world lives in poverty. Now, that is still millions of people across the world that are in what I cannot even imagine is terrible circumstances, gut-wrenching poverty, and we should be concerned, we should be working to end that, and we are. And there are incredible organizations all over the planet that are doing phenomenal work to make sure that that becomes a reality. My good friend Randy Finkbeiner in South Africa is working diligently to bring families and children out of poverty right now. Nazarene Compassionate Ministries works all over the globe to make sure that that becomes a reality. In fact, the UN's #1 goal right now, if you go on their website, is to end global extreme poverty by 2030. And it's actually within reach. That's good news. That is something that no one in the world could have possibly believed would have happened 100 years ago. Mind-blowing. That there would be no such thing as extreme poverty. It's incredible. In the last 20 years, extreme poverty has been cut in half. That's good news. Now, you probably won't read about that in the newspaper. You probably won't see it on an evening news show. Maybe at the very end, once they've told you all the terrible stuff that's going on. But today, by the end of today, at midnight, 137,000 people will have been taken out of extreme poverty. And that has been the case every single day for the last 30 years. Every day, 137,000 people escape extreme, gut-wrenching, life-crushing poverty. That's fantastic. That is good news. And there, again, is a ton of work still to be done. And there are people doing that, and that is wonderful, and we need to support that. But celebrating that good news does not diminish what we still have left to do. It's good to celebrate sometimes. And those incredible gains in ending extreme poverty, those have a direct and critical impact on global violence, which has also been plummeting over the last couple of 100 years. Plummeting. And I know that we read about and we see and we hear all the time these stories about just how dangerous the world is right now. And there's definitely danger out there. But compared to the people that came before us, compared to our forefathers, again, we live in unbelievable safety, things that they could not have even imagined when they were alive. For instance, and there's data on this, which I found really fun and really depressing. If you were an Englishman in the 1500s, you had a 20 out of 100,000 chance that you would be murdered. 20. If you were Dutch, 50 out of 100,000. If you were Italian, 70 out of 100,000. Today, those numbers have tanked. England is now 1 out of 100,000. The Netherlands, 0.6. And those murder-happy Italians from the 1500s, 0.7. Which means that you are 100 times safer than Leonardo da Vinci when he was painting and when he was inventing. Isn't that weird? I think that's interesting to think about because I don't hear stuff like that very often. It's rare that I get good news about how safe I am. But that is nothing compared to the amount of violence and death when it comes to war. If you are looking to insult somebody, especially some sort of political candidate or somebody who holds office, the number one go-to insult, especially if you think there's some sort of a tyrannical leader, is to call them Hitler. Oh, that guy's Hitler. Which makes sense because he was an incredibly evil man. Current estimates place the Holocaust around 6 to 7 million lives stolen. That is an unfathomable number, especially if you're a sophomore in your world history class and you're reading that random piece of data out of a textbook. You just cannot comprehend what that even means. It's just a number. But when you're strolling through the silent courtyards of Dachau in Germany, it is soul-crushing. Crystal and I got a chance to walk through Dachau when we were in Germany in 2005, and it was indescribable. It was indescribable. In 2001, I got to go to Israel and tour the Holy Land, and it was amazing. But there was nothing like standing at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial. They have piles of little tiny children's shoes. And that little, that statistic that you learn about in sophomore year becomes very real. It is a very surreal experience. And I cannot imagine living through those moments. You know, watching your children try and grow up in a world where that is current reality. It's not even something I can comprehend. But try to imagine, if you can, which you can't, what life would have been like for the average person when Genghis Khan was sweeping through the continent of Asia on horseback in the 1200s. He and his Mongol army were responsible for the death of 40 million. 40 million with sword and arrow. They effectively wiped out 11% of the entire population of the world. 11%. The weird thing that I found as I was doing this grotesque research over the last week, looking for some good news when it came to safety, violence, poverty, is that most of the most extreme, most deadly conflicts, wars, battles, I'd never heard of. Millions of people dead at a time in wars that I couldn't pronounce their names, let alone tell you anything about why they happened. And yet millions of people were killed in this war. I'd never heard about it. Really bizarre. But even when you take into account all of the conflicts, all of the wars and the terrorist attacks and the murders and the grisly things that you see on the news and you read on your news app on your phone, even when you take all of the things that are currently going on in the world into account, we are far safer than any other generation of humanity that's ever come before us. And that's kind of depressing. Take motor vehicle accidents, for instance. We now have cell phones. We've got, in our Honda Odyssey, we've got a little DVD player in the back so the boys can, watch a movie and we get to listen to it 700 times in a row. Even with all of the distractions that we currently have while we're driving, things that people didn't have 20 years ago, especially 50 or 100 years ago, despite all of the additional distractions, all of the extra motor vehicles that are on the road, all of the increase in speed, because they didn't drive as fast as we do, well, at least as fast as I do, back in the 20s. Motor vehicle deaths per vehicle mile traveled have plummeted to an all-time low, which is really interesting to think about. In 1924, there were 24 deaths per 100 miles of vehicles driven in the United States. 24. In 2019, there was 1.1 death per 100 million miles driven. We are 24 times less likely to die in a motor vehicle accident today than we were 100 years ago. That's incredible. That's awesome. And wait until everybody comes out with their autopilot. This is going to be even better, especially because I won't be driving. There have been incredible strides, great strides by a lot of brilliant and wonderful and kind and well thought out people who have worked very hard to bring the world to the point where we're at right now. Just a little bit safer, a little more sound for everybody. From those soldiers who are standing guard on foreign soil right now, protecting the lives of people that they've never met, that speak languages they probably don't speak, but they are there willing to risk their lives to save them and protect them from tyrants and dictators, to everyday mundane people like Nils Bohlin, who was the Volvo chief safety engineer who invented the 3-point seatbelt and saved millions of lives. There are little tiny things that surround us, little inventions, little stuff that we don't even notice. The fact that the paint in this room doesn't have lead in it. Things that make us just a little bit safer, that allow you to sleep a little bit more soundly. It seems to me that when I look at the world that surrounds us, and I block out all the stuff that comes at us from all these different angles, when I look at the world, what I see is the Spirit of God that has been constantly and continually working diligently in a million different ways, slowly pulling humanity out of poverty and away from violence and death, towards this redemption that the Apostle Paul speaks of in Romans 8, the prophet Isaiah speaks of in chapter 2, where the prophet Isaiah says this: "For the Lord's teaching will go out from Zion, His word will go out from Jerusalem. The Lord will mediate between nations and will settle international disputes. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will no longer fight against nation, nor train for war anymore. Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord." I love this visual that Isaiah paints. This prophecy when he looks forward into the future, that God is going to be continuing to create well past the point when he's going to be called home, where the nations of the world reforge their weapons of death into gardening tools. This future where instead of fighting and killing each other, we plant crops and we feed each other. Instead of meeting on a battlefield, we meet around a banquet table. Declarations of war are no longer signed because they've been replaced with invitations to celebration. That day is coming, but it's not here yet. We are safer, but we're not safe. Evil is being expelled by the Spirit of God from our world, but it's not expelled yet. We have come a long way, and there's a lot that we should be proud of. But there's still a lot of work to do. And as followers of Christ, we have been called to partake in that work. Now, you may not invent the next seatbelt style life-saving device for the next Tesla whatever, or Volkswagen Adriel. And you may not serve in uniform, protecting the homes and the lives of people you've never met. You may not solve world hunger or world poverty or climate change or any of the other things that are affecting the least of these in the world right now. But you have been called to follow so close in the footsteps of our rabbi that you get covered with the dust of his sandals. And as we walk this path that Jesus leads us down and we become the people that he designed us to be, peacemaking, not peaceful, peacemaking, will be a part of the work that he calls you to. And you may never physically save somebody's life, but you may be the person that they turn to in their darkest moments, in those moments where they don't know what to do, they don't know where to turn, and they have no hope for the future. But when they see you living a life of patience and love and grace, when through your actions with them and with other people that you may not even notice they're watching, you earn the right to be given their trust. Maybe so much so that you become a safe place for them. A safe place to maybe be the very first person that they're vulnerable with, willing to talk about what's actually going on in their life that they don't know how they're going to make it through. You may be the very first one who speaks of their value, who makes them feel wanted, welcome, something they may have never felt before. You may be their very first encounter with Jesus, or you may be the one who allows them to take the very first steps in their healing because they have met with the people of God before. And it crushed them. You don't have to radically change the world in order to radically change somebody's life. This is how the Spirit of God has worked through the people of God from the very beginning. Little late night conversations where things start to actually get real. Moments of transparency where either you open up or they open up. That habit of generosity that the Holy Spirit's been kind of prompting you and nagging you and trying to get you to take seriously and maybe ramp up a little bit. Those short prayers that you whisper on somebody else's behalf. Maybe it's by boldly talking about what God has been doing in your life that plants that little seed, that puts the next plank on the bridge that will get them to finally cross over into the kingdom of God. I don't know. You don't know. But there's a reason that God has you where you're at. This is how the people of Jesus slowly changed the world that they found themselves in when Jesus went back to heaven and they were left in the Roman Empire. This is how the Roman Empire was taken over. It was not by force. It was not by the sword. It was not by economic coercion, but the fruit of the Spirit. It was the fruit of the Spirit in the lives of the people of God. Just going about their daily lives, doing their thing, but constantly maturing, constantly harvesting the fruit of the Spirit, love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and faithfulness and self-control, all of those things that are God's fingerprints in your life. Fantastic for you, but even sweeter for the people that God puts around you. This is how we change the world. This is the pull of God's Holy Spirit over hundreds and hundreds of years, walking us gently by the hand, away from poverty, away from violence, and into this new kingdom. And we've made some good progress, but there's a lot of progress left. There is a reason that Martin Luther King Jr. quoted a 111-year-old sermon at that time in a speech that he gave in the middle of the civil rights movement in our country. And despite all of the pushback and all of the anger and all of the violence that he had come up against, he saw progress. He saw the progress that had been made when looking back into history. And so he quoted Pastor Theodore Parker's sermon. A sermon that Pastor Parker had given 8 years before the Civil War broke out in the United States. A war that was fought so that one man could own another man. And this is what Dr. Martin Luther King said. Evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy a palace and Christ a cross. But that same Christ arose and split history into AD and BC, so that even the life of Caesar must be dated by his name. Yes, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And when you start looking for the ways that God is working in and around you, when you look for it, you ever notice that you find the things that you're looking for eventually, unless it's my own personal keys, which I never seem to be able to find? When you look for things, you'll find them. When you begin to focus on things, you'll notice them more often. And when you're looking for the ways that God is working in the world, you will notice it. But if you're looking for reasons to be scared, you'll see those too. I challenge you this week, for the rest of your life, but specifically this week. Watch for the ways in which God is orchestrating the world around you. Ignore that constant cry of wolf, wolf, oh my gosh, be terrified. Youth group, we just told, Aaron DeVoe just told the group about Aesop's fable of the little boy who cried wolf. Danger, danger, everybody run, everybody be concerned. And then there's no danger. And then again and again and again, and eventually when it was desperately needed, nobody paid attention. There are things that we should be paying attention to. There are dangers in the world. But don't be caught off guard when you constantly are being yelled at that there's a wolf when really there's not a wolf. If you pay attention, if you search for it, if you ask God to open up your eyes and your ears to be able to see and to hear and to notice the things that God is doing around you, you will find that our world is far more safe and sound than you're led to believe. We have made far more progress. There's far more good news out there than you may have been told. Because we worship and we serve a big, loving, powerful God who has empowered us to live lives of faith, not fear, so that we can love and serve the people that God has placed around us.